Hello, this is Graham and this is a video about models of human growth and development for level 4 and 5 counselling and psychotherapy students, and perhaps as a reminder for level 6. In a previous video we looked at the idea of philosophy of mind and how serious contenders for the title of being a modality in counselling all have a philosophy of mind, an underlying set of assumptions about how the human mind works. In this video we go one step further, because if a counselling modality is expected to somehow help people change something, then it must surely be possible to explain what the outcome will be and how they'll get there. We'll look at theories of change which attempt to describe the how later, but in this video we're going to look at the outcome. Where is it that people are heading when they engage with a psychotherapist? It's easy to confuse models of human development with processes of change, because they both have the idea of a timeline, a start, a middle, and an end. The idea of humans developing through a series of stages in life was first proposed by the Swiss philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau in his book entitled Émile, or On Education, published in 1762. The book took a fictional character, Émile, and charted the child's upbringing and how it was affected by his parents and the world around them. He described 3 stages: infancy, childhood, and adolescence. Also of importance to psychotherapists is that one of the chapters in his book, The Profession of Faith of the Savoyard Vicar, made the distinction between personal spirituality and organised religion. This was considered so outrageously damning of the Church that it led to the book being banned in France, and the remaining copies of it were burnt. This alignment of human development and natural spirituality is at the core of transpersonal psychotherapy, and also at the heart of the concept of self-actualization pursued by the humanistic schools of counselling. Rousseau believed that with the right education, a child could be raised to be an ideal citizen, preserving the innate goodness of an infant despite living in a corrupt and corrupting society. Fortunately, quite a few copies of his book survived, and there was an English translation published the next year. The book became the foundation of the new French education system in the post-revolution French Republic from 1789 onwards, though Rousseau would sadly not come to see this. Incidentally, the book also laid the foundations for modern nursery nursing, with very strongly argued cases for not swaddling infants and for them to be breastfed for an extended time. We're interested in his ideas because the concept of stages, rather than a simple smooth transition, has dictated the theory of development in most counselling modalities ever since. Indeed, Rousseau is often described as the father of modern developmental psychology. Soon after the publication of Charles Darwin's Origin of Species in 1859, psychologists began to look for evolutionary explanations based on adaptation and selection for the development of our cognitive processes, intelligence, and personality. This search continues today. Stanley Hall was the first president of the American Psychology Association and president of Clark University. Clearly strongly influenced by their work, in 1909 he invited both Freud and Jung to attend a conference at Clark University. Hall straddled a difficult divide between the emerging scientific psychology and the more philosophical psychoanalytic theory. Incidentally, in 1917 he published a major work on the psychology of Christ and those who believe in him. It wasn't particularly well received, but it remains one of the most pioneering and comprehensive books on religious psychology in this modern era. Much more significant was his interest in Darwin's evolutionary theories, and especially that of recapitulation, as it had been further developed by Ernst Haeckel in the late 1800s. Freud himself had been influenced by Darwin and Haeckel. Recapitulation theory essentially says that as we develop from the fetus to the adult, so we go through the same stages as other animals. Imagine this as a train journey. Fish got off the train at the first station and remained in their state of development there. Amphibians got off at the next stop, reptiles at the third, birds at the fourth, shrews at the fifth, and so on until the bonobos got off at the last but one stop, and we did so at the terminus. Hall's perspective on human development was effectively that we inherit not only physical characteristics of previous generations, but also aspects of their attitudes and behaviours. Furthermore, that we also inherit the characteristics of earlier stages of human development. The purpose of education is to bring the infant up to the current state, and through life experience for us to display even better qualities which some of us had inherited, and the capacity for which we will have passed on to our offspring. To be generous in terms of current society, Hall was a little confused. On the one hand, in line with the humanistic schools of therapy, he believed that individuals had immense capacity to achieve if they were allowed to do so, and he mentored one of the first Black American psychology professors, Francis Cecil Sumner. His work on the struggles of adolescence and then senescence, the later stages of life, paved the way for the recognition of their significance to both individual mental health and societal impacts. Despite being highly critical of Freudian psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic theory, he brought Freud and Jung to the US to discuss their work among the psychology community. He was a pioneer and an exceptional advocate for other people's ideas, even if he seems to have misinterpreted many of them. He was so influential that he became the 72nd most cited psychologist of the whole of the 20th century. On the other hand, his perspective on sex, gender, Judaism, race, and eugenics would be totally unacceptable today. Most students will be introduced to the idea of stages of development through the work of Sigmund Freud and his psychosexual theory. So let's remind ourselves of Freud's theory of human development. Freud believed that the adult personality was developed through a series of stages in which the child primarily sought pleasure by stimulating certain erogenous zones in sequence. The 5 psychosexual stages are the oral, the anal, the phallic, the latent, and the genital. Being satisfied can result in a healthy personality, while being unsatisfied at any particular stage can result in what Freud called fixation, which would initially lead to anxiety and generally persisted into adulthood as a neurosis. Whether a neurosis of this kind would be sufficiently debilitating or affect their quality of life particularly adversely as to need therapy is as much a matter for the individual to decide as any clinician. To sum them up, the oral stage fixation, from birth to 1 year old, might lead to a passive, gullible, immature, but potentially manipulative personality. Anal stage fixation from 1 to 3 years old might lead, on the one hand, to an obsessively organised personality, or on the other to a chaotic, reckless, defiant personality. Fixation in the phallic stage from 3 to 6 years old could lead to low self-esteem and sexual promiscuity. In the latency stage from 6 to puberty, fixation could lead to immaturity and an inability to form fulfilling, non-sexual relationships as an adult. And finally, in the genital stage, which Freud said lasted from puberty to death, fixation explains all kinds of sex-related challenges, from frigidity and impotence, note the language, sexual perversions, and difficulty forming sexual relationships as an adult. People sometimes dismiss Freud's theory out of hand. Firstly, it's important to say that he went into considerably more detail about each stage than most people are aware. From a scientific perspective, there is a body of empirical evidence that his identification of the stages and their challenges at that stage were accurate. There is, however, little evidence to support the relationship between a disrupted stage, fixation, and adult personality. Secondly, it's been suggested, and pretty well evidenced from his own writings, that he was himself somewhat sexually obsessed, and was inclined to look for sexual issues within his clients. Feminists, exemplified by Karen Horney, have challenged and proposed alternatives to Freud's interpretation of the phallic stage especially. Anthropological studies have shown that his theories only apply to Western societies, and those modelled on them. Elsewhere in the world, different forms of society prompt very different paths to child and adult development. Jean Piaget was a Swiss developmental psychologist whose theory of cognitive development tries to explain how humans gradually come to acquire, construct, and use knowledge. He was a postgraduate at the Alfred Binet Laboratory in Paris, a world-famous centre for the study of education, when he conducted a large number of child observations. He noticed that children of different ages made different kinds of mistakes while trying to solve problems, and began to speculate why this happened. He suggested that children's potential didn't change, but that the quality of their decision-making got better over time. He believed that children experience the world through actions, by representing things with words, thinking logically, and using reasoning. Piaget proposed 4 stages to describe the development process of children: the sensory-motor stage, pre-operational stage, concrete operational stage, and formal operational stage. To Piaget, cognitive development was a progressive reorganization of mental processes as the child's body matured and as they experienced the world around them differently. He believed that children construct an understanding of the world around them, experience discrepancies between what they already know and what they discover in their environment, and then adjust their ideas to suit. Effectively, this is what Donald Schoen described later as reflection in action. Piaget developed his theory over many years and added considerably more material and complexity to it. As far as Piaget was concerned, cognitive development, the development of our ability to think, is at the core of human development and essential to the development of all other qualities. He didn't really address issues of being stuck at one stage, as he believed that any child could ultimately progress from one to another. Of all the stage models of human development, Piaget seems to have been adopted, incorporated, adapted, and manipulated the most. It's certainly been one of the most influential in its own way. Of particular interest to psychotherapists is that Piaget is the precursor to what are known as invitational education, or i.e. models of learning, where the teacher invites rather than instructs, and as such it complements self-determination theory, Deci and Ryan's approach to motivation, both of which are very significant in modern-day approaches to person-centered or humanistic counselling. No account of developmental stages would be adequate without a mention of what is, perhaps erroneously, called Erickson's 8 stages of man. Erroneous, firstly, because it's attributed to Erik Erikson, but was actually a collaborative work over 60 years with his wife Joan. Secondly, in 1998, when she was 93, and 4 years after Erik's death, Joan published an updated copy of one of their books, The Life Cycle Completed, an extended version, to which she added a 9th stage between the 7th and 8th original ones. This has prompted considerable acclaim because it reflected changes that are going on in society that might otherwise have detracted from their original model. The Ericksons' work deserves a separate video at the very least. Erik was the son of a Danish Jewish nurse who conceived him in 1902 while alone after the breakdown of her first marriage. He was adopted by her second husband, but his true history and biological father were kept from him until his mid-adolescence. He spent the rest of his life reflecting on the nature of identity crises. Somewhat troubled, Erik dropped out after secondary school, spent some time wandering around Europe doing sketches and portraits for payment. He subsequently became an art teacher, then was offered a job teaching art to the children of wealthy parents who were undergoing psychoanalysis in Vienna with Anna Freud. She suggested that he undertook the training as a psychoanalyst himself, and he simultaneously trained as a Montessori teacher. These were his only qualifications. In 1933, he and his wife Joan emigrated firstly to Denmark and then to the United States. Erik and Joan, it seems, had an extraordinary ability to develop deep working connections, and they would encounter and work with some of the most famous names in psychology, anthropology, and sociology. As well as his private therapy practice, Erik became a full professor at Harvard, then Yale, and then California Berkeley universities, before returning to Harvard in the 1960s. He did embedded anthropology studies of two indigenous North American tribes, the Sioux and the Yurok, and made widely recognized contributions in supporting their communities. He even won the Pulitzer Prize for his book, Gandhi's Life. It was in 1950 that Erickson published his most popular book, Childhood and Society. When you study psychoanalytic theory, you'll learn more about Erickson and the ways in which he saw the relationship between id and ego differently to Freud. It was out of their reflections on this that the Ericksons created the 8 and subsequently 9-stage model of human development. They gave age ranges as guides, but they emphasized the nature of the conflict represented and the outcome rather than precise ages. Our final model of human development is that of Abraham Maslow. Maslow was one of the original founders of the humanistic school of psychology and therapy. Humanists, which of course included Carl Rogers, believe that all human beings have the capacity to achieve great things and are intrinsically good people. The role of the therapist is to help them believe this and to realize their potential. Like many psychotherapists before them, the humanists, including both Rogers and Maslow, believed that since our potential was entirely within us, there was no need for external entities, such as God, to shape our lives. In his original paper in 1943, Maslow presented a 5-stage model of human development. Over the years, he began to realize that this had oversimplified his ideas and been widely misinterpreted. In 1954 and again in 1970, he published updates to his ideas in a book entitled Motivation and Personality. Finally, in 1984, a group of his close colleagues published a 3rd edition of this work, incorporating what they knew of his evolving theories. In this edition, 3 further stages were included. The humanists had originally felt that the ultimate state was one of a peaceful, personal generativity, which they called self-actualization, in which humans achieved great things with grace. From his early work, he'd suggested that barely 2% of people would come close to this. Maslow felt that this was not the whole story. By the time he died in 1970, he had acknowledged that more people could achieve this state temporarily, and that there was a further step which really typified that small 2%, and that was what he called transcendence. Alongside these changes, he corrected a misperception that one had to fulfill each of the required outcomes at each level before progressing up the steps in the hierarchy. Instead, he felt that this was only necessary to have addressed them sufficiently in order to move on. Fulfilling most of the needs is ultimately a lifelong process. We all need food and clothing throughout our lives. Similarly, we all need shelter. Initially, some of the basic needs are satisfied for us by our parents, but ultimately we take responsibility ourselves. Other higher needs, such as those of esteem, cognition and aesthetics, may have to wait until we are adolescents or adults to be met. With a few exceptions, self-actualization and transcendence are unlikely to be met at all, or if they are, then it will only be in late adulthood and old age. Thank you for watching. Your feedback is always welcome, as are ideas for future courses, classes or videos.